Deployment in this game is extremely important. Sometimes it can lose you games by deploying wrong. It's not something to overlook. Here's some general principles that'll have you deploying strong every game, allowing you to put maximum pressure on your opponent and keep your models as safe as possible. The most important thing to remember about deploying is that you cannot be too timid. Being too timid allows your opponent to run freely and you won't be able to do anything about it. It's generally a bad idea to deploy your whole team on conceal or on engage. Let's talk about which models to put on conceal, as that's far easier than which models to put on engage. In fact, it's so easy you've probably been doing it right and not even realizing it. Models in cover with a conceal order cannot be shot by enemies. But it does matter what kind of cover those models are in. Light cover does not protect your model from someone on a vantage point, so make sure to put models that you're okay with potentially getting shot right away in light cover. A well set up board should not allow more than 1 or 2 shots from vantage points turn 1. The safest spot for models with a conceal order is in cover provided by heavy terrain, as vantage doesn't work on heavy terrain. So your scary melee threats that want to start concealed or your sniper model with silent should start in heavy cover. The only thing that can get past heavy cover with a conceal order is the indirect special rule, and that's very rarely seen on weapons with a range longer than 6 inches. It's easy to determine which models to put on conceal, but which models do you put on engage? Well, your best shooting profiles, of course. Now you might be thinking, George, you rugged philanthropist, I don't want my plasma gunner to die right away. Fear not. The next thing to remember about good deployment is how visibility and obscuring works. Remember, you cannot be shot if your model cannot be seen. Hide your gunners behind walls out of visibility and then pop them out when a good target presents itself. Luckily, most walls also have vantage points attached to them, so you could pop up to increase your target choice. If you run out of space to prevent visibility, the next best thing is to make your models obscured by being more than 2 inches away from heavy terrain. This is much less safe, so any model you want to be shooting that can move in any way should attempt to stay hidden and not obscured. But it is a way to keep models with an engage order safe from shooting attacks. Of course, visibility and obscuring is dependent on terrain layout, but any decent board should have at least one spot to hide some models in your deployment zone to be out of visibility, and some amount of heavy terrain in the center so the two teams can't just shoot each other from across the board without really looking for weird and difficult sight lines. I'll go over terrain layout in a different video because that's a rabbit hole. Now, let's talk about some exceptions, because they do exist. The biggest and most troublesome exception to this is if you are deploying against a team with a blast weapon. Then you absolutely want to make sure that you either do not let them shoot any of your models at all, which is nearly impossible if you actually want to cover the board and threaten objectives. So you have to spread your models out. Fairly easy with teams like Space Marines who have 6 dudes. Pretty difficult for Pathfinders and Vetguard who have more than 12 dudes. If you can't spread out so that everyone is out of blast range, then the next best thing is to protect your most important models by keeping them out of visibility and out of range of anybody likely to get blasted. Remember, blast weapons do not care about cover or conceal for the extra attacks. If a blast weapon goes off, everyone around the initial target is eating shrapnel cake, and shrapnel cake is not gluten-free. With those things taken into consideration, you're ready to deploy into a position of strength. But how aggressive should you deploy? Well, that's a great question, viewer. Glad to know you're paying attention. Most of the time your goal in deploying is to make sure you take 0 casualties, while maximizing the number of enemy casualties and objectives scored on turn 1. Of course, this rarely works out, but that's the default goal of deployment. If you can manage to deploy your models so that they are entirely safe in your deployment zone, then you've deployed in a position of strength. However, you can also deploy very aggressively if your opponent is too timid. If you, as the attacker, are deploying against a defender that has put all their models on conceal, or most of their models including their best shooting profiles on conceal, then you can deploy much more aggressively, unless you're going against a Wormblade, but they're weird. If you deploy with more engage orders than just your best shooting profiles, still on models out of visibility or being obscured, then you can still be safe in your deployment zone, but punish your opponent for being too timid by threatening shooting from many more avenues. The last thing to consider when setting up your deployment is distance and cover to objectives. It's important to be able to have a plan to get to objectives quickly and score as safely as possible, even if that means using your last model for turn 1 to move out onto an objective and hoping you get initiative for turn 2. That's usually not a great idea, but victory points are victory points. This is where your scouting option comes into play. The scouting options are there to give you an edge, and if you deploy correctly, you'll see that you rarely actually need to flip someone's order turn 1. That gives you much more flexibility to try to get the initiative, or push onto a mid-board objective early by using a free dash, or even getting more cover with an additional barricade. If you don't need barricades to hide models behind on the deployment line, then you can usually put at least one barricade on an objective that's close to deployment and that doesn't have any cover on it. Good deployment keeps your team alive turn 1. Great deployment does that and also lets you score points from primary and secondary objectives. Once you get to the point where you can deploy with a plan for turn 1 and also extend that plan out to turn 2, then you have mastered the art of deploying. Huge thanks to Travis from Brooklyn Strategist in Brooklyn, New York, and Fernando Ace Marcos for helping me to make sure this information is as useful as possible.